Welcome to Unfoodable Weekly. I'm your host, Paul Barron, and this is the show where we cover news, trends, and insights for restaurant and hospitality. Today we're going to be talking about craft beer and wine and the trends that are driving this beverage business. Let's get to it. With over 300 million social consumers migrating to wine and beer worldwide, you can see why this phenomenon is really a top topic for the restaurant industry. Today we're looking at it from a baseline of what craft beer and wine are really affecting in terms of consumers. Now, I'm a craft beer lover, but what we are seeing is craft beer is getting on menus a lot more in the restaurant business, everything from fast casual to fine dining. But wine is kind of migrating to a certain demographic across menus as well. This is kind of one of those things that I'm not sure why it's happening, but we are seeing kind of a division of these two spirits, these two beverages that may be having some big impact on the industry overall. So we're going to try to get some tips from a couple of experts today talking about each one of these categories. And joining us today is Jennifer Euther from Jackson Family Wines. Jennifer, before we get started, let's talk a little bit about who you are and what you do at Jackson Family Wines.
Well, I'm living the dream. I have a great job with Jackson Family Wines. I'm born and raised in outside of Toronto, Canada, and I still live here. And Jackson Family Wines has a big presence in Canada.
Right.
So I am a bit of an ambassador. I also take care of prestige accounts and do things like this, promote media, marketing, a little of everything.
Yeah. So how long have you been a somm?
I have been a somm for about 12 years.
Great.
It took me several years to get my master's. But I did start off with just the certification of sommelier.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about consumer sentiment. So one of the things that we look at to determine kind of how culinary trends are moving in the industry is consumer sentiment by demographic. In the wine category, when you look at, there's four categories that we look at in terms of the demographics: the 18 to 34 crowd, the 35 to 44 crowd, 45 to 54, and the 55 plus. So you kind of have a division of maybe the little millennials, the Gen X, boomers, and so on. And the sentiment on the top 25 wine brands, this was the breakdown, and kind of want to get your opinion on why you think that might be. The millennial crowd was actually the lowest at 32.9%, or 32.9 points, versus the highest at 68.4, which was the 35 to 44 crowd. So do you feel that millennials are just now starting to experiment with wine and really are just starting to understand what it's about? Or do you feel like there is a true division in the demographic favor of wine?
There's certainly interest from the younger generation, and I find there's more experimentation with the younger generation. However, in that demographic of 35 to 44, you have a combination of this interest in food and wine and matching, and you know, food TV is huge right now, as you're aware of. But you also have a situation where this is the demographic that is entertaining and also doing a lot of business entertaining.
Right.
And so what we're seeing is that guests really feel the need to be up on wine and be able to order wine and feel comfortable with that in a restaurant for their guests, and also be able to host really well at their homes. And I think that's also helping to drive this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're leading to is that, you know, the education process is one that really takes a little bit of time to start to mature around the concept of wine. I know for me, even there's certain types of wine that I'll explore for the first time, and I've been drinking for 25 years, and it seems like it's just a never-ending education. Is that something that you find consumers are really embracing along with operators today in terms of kind of creating an education platform?
Absolutely. Education is key, and what we're finding is that, you know, when you think of kind of the old style restaurant with sommeliers, and sort of telling people what they're going to be drinking, that's not really acceptable in today's restaurant scene. What we're finding more is that people want to engage the sommelier and discuss, what's the menu, what would work with the food that they're having. They're open to listening, to learning, to being educated.
Right.
And SOMs are doing a great job of this, of connecting with the guests and just enriching the experience now. So it really has changed, and I do feel that consumers are incredibly thirsty for knowledge. What I've seen in teaching with the Court of Masters is that you don't just have students who are working towards their sommelier or higher levels, and in the profession you have lots of general interest, where we're seeing students who could be lawyers, could be doctors, could have many other lines of work, and it's just they're very interested and passionate and they want to get the education.
Well, let's break down the top wine categories. When you look at Pinot, Riesling, Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, the Sauvignon Blanc, and Syrah, those were our top 7 wine categories on our restaurant social media index. Do you feel like if you were picking those as a sommelier, what would you order those in Pinot, Riesling, Cab, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Syrah? What do you feel like is the leading trend in terms of wine selection there?
Well, Pinot Noir is becoming huge, and I think for a variety of reasons, but naturally they're higher in acid, they're lower in tannins, they're easy to drink with or without food, but they work brilliantly with food because of the acidity, and they can be lower in alcohol. So I completely understand the trend there. And the other great thing about Pinot Noir is that they can be very complex and very almost ethereal. And I do see that red grape really trending right now. Chardonnay is having a comeback after it was anything but Chardonnay for a while. And it's interesting to see that. The great thing about Chardonnay is that it is quite a neutral grape. But depending on where it's planted, what clonal selection you use, and what the winemaker does to it, so if there's malolactic conversion, if there's oak used, you can really change the texture of the wine. And one thing I love about Chardonnays is the texture. Yeah. And so I completely understand that that grape would be on the rise. Riesling is the sommelier's grape.
Sure.
All us geeky sommeliers love Riesling, and it's great because it's really high in acid, even when you get the dessert styles. And what's great about Riesling is that you can make everything from sparkling to bone dry to off dry to a luscious dessert style wine. And they age phenomenally. And they're very, very versatile with food, especially great with food that has heat in it.
Right. So
Indian food, Thai food, things that can be tricky to pair. So I get that. Merlot is interesting. I wouldn't have thought that Merlot was one of the prominent grape varieties. It's one of my favorites. And I love it from California, Washington, and Tuscany, and Bordeaux, of course. But that's very, very interesting to me that Merlot would be on the upswing.
So really, it sounds like you would recommend to operators, don't be afraid to try a little bit more complexity in your wine menus, kind of venture out a little bit more in terms of trying to introduce new wines to consumers. Would you say that's the way to go?
Absolutely. We had a saying at work when I was a buyer, which is if we don't have it, we can't sell it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important as an operator that you test the market, both with wine styles and with price points. So when I walk into a restaurant and I see the most expensive bottle I can buy is $100, I feel limited. What if I was celebrating that night and I wanted to spend more? And so when you limit yourself with styles or with price points, I think you're not really going to be able to gauge what your market, what your clientele really want. And absolutely, I feel that as people learn and become more educated about wine and more interested in wine, they become also more adventurous. Yep. And I think it's important to have the staples. That's also a trend, is going into a really funky, hip, cool restaurant and there's nothing but natural wine, from funky countries, which is great. But what if I just want a Chardonnay from California?
Sure, yeah.
So absolutely. I don't think you should alienate your clientele either by going too esoteric.
Yeah. Give me a Som's pitch on a good wine to look at with my pasta pairing for the night.
Well, depending on what your sauce is, because that's very important, and how much salt there is, because that can really steer the wine choice as well. Great Italian white wines are excellent choices with seafood pastas, with anything with bitterness in it as well. So let's say you had some arugula in your pasta or some bitter greens. They have a wonderful sort of lemon pith quality to them and bitter almond quality as well, and they work really well. And you can go back to that regional wine and cuisine sort of match. Anything with acid as well works great with Italian food because there is a lot of tomato in Italian food and there's a lot of acidity, which is awesome, but you have to work a wine with that, and that can be tricky. So naturally, Italian wines work very well, like Sangiovese or Barbera or a Barolo, for example. But you could go also to the New World with higher acid, lower alcohol reds, like a Pinot Noir could be a really great choice.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, it's been great having you on the show this week. It's kind of fun picking a sommelier's brain around what's happening in the wine world, especially with all this new data that we're seeing from a social side. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a joy having you.
Thank you.
Joining us next is Ben McDonald with Brew Mechanics. Ben, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Yeah, great. Listen, craft beer. Wow, there are so many new trends happening in the world of craft beer. Wanted to kind of pick your brain today about what you're seeing overall around craft beer. Before we get started, tell us a bit about you and Brew Mechanics.
Okay, thank you. Brew Mechanics sort of started as a hobby. I kind of got into craft beer late, as opposed to some of my friends. After college, I just, I really didn't want to get into beer anymore. I thought it was kind of all the same. And then maybe the last 5 years or so, someone introduced me to craft beer, and I've been going ever since. And what it's turned into is I took what was my profession, which was marketing, and just brought that into my hobby. And so basically I work as a consultant for either wannabe craft brewers or guys who are kind of new in it.
Interesting. So you get a chance to kind of see the real feet on the street as craft brewers start to build their business, get moving. So maybe this is a great question for you, and that is, why are we seeing so much concentration on the millennial crowd for craft beer? Why are they kind of leading the charge? Our data is showing some pretty big movement in the millennial crowd around sentiment, meaning the love affair of craft breweries and craft beer. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question, Paul. I feel like one of the reasons is, well, a lot of your guys coming out right now who are very creative, very innovative, are from that crowd. They are millennials.
Yep.
These are guys who are looking at, for these guys, craft beer is more of an art form than just a business. So it's a way of expressing themselves. And I feel like with the millennial movement or sort of the culture, the sort of underlying tone with it is, let's look at what is. Let's look at traditional and let's make it express like our, how we feel about things and how we value things. And I feel like craft beer is right along that same thought pattern.
Right. That's an interesting point you just made in terms of kind of bringing in their own cultural dynamics into the evolution of the beer itself, or maybe that's a way that millennials are able to align with a certain craft brewer. I know here in Florida we've got Due South and Holy Mackerel and some of these guys, Funky Buddha, who do a great job really aligning with the local breweries. And then we've just had a few brewers here in Miami that have kind of started to blossom up. So interesting comment on that. When you look at cities though, so let's talk about that. Miami has a big beer scene coming, but we're not really known for awesome beer scenes like, say, a city like Portland. What are the cities that you're seeing that are really kind of emerging as the top craft beer cities of the country?
Well, that's a very good question, and also a very I wouldn't say unanswerable, but it's a very complex, it's a depth question. Really, I feel like it's kind of, craft beer is almost counterintuitive. And I say that just meaning that you would expect huge cities with huge populations to sort of take the lead with craft beer. But because craft beer is such a grassroots, organic kind of cultural thing, it really needs a sort of incubator. So places like Portland, places like Vermont, a lot of these smaller, tighter, more compact areas have been great incubators for craft beer, for small, almost like mom and pop. A lot of these guys were hobbyists who someone said, hey, man, this beer is great. This is fantastic. Why don't you start a brewery? And a lot of these guys said, that's a great idea. And they started it without a lot of business savvy, without a lot of experience. And after a couple of years, they kind of caught up to that and were able to have a vibrant business. And so I think that's what lends itself to so many of these guys popping up and so many of these guys in local areas starting to resonate. And with the bigger cities there, like right now, I would say more the areas, like I said, everywhere across the country, everything's growing. But the areas to really look at are places like you said, Florida. Florida is a huge area. Texas is another huge area, Georgia. And what's happening is a lot of the guys who are established, like Sierra Nevada, just I'm trying to think of some different names that you may have heard of. Sierra Nevada is one of them I'm thinking of. Heavy Seas, Cigar City, right out of Florida there.
Yeah,
Odell Brewing. A lot of these guys, Dogfish Head. A lot of these guys have said, you know what? The greatest places right now we're kind of focusing on is the South, because these places are just kind of, they had little offerings, and they're starting to really develop these areas where people are really interested in craft beer. So it's a perfect seeding ground for these guys who are established to kind of come in and provide, this is what's happening across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting as we see more and more of the craft brewers really starting to infiltrate some of the restaurant industry itself, whether it's independents or even brands who are using beer pairings with some of their foods. A lot of that is happening. Do you feel like that is just going to continue to explode as the craft beer community continues to grow?
Absolutely. I feel like that is right there. You just nailed it on the head. It's one thing to be able to sit down and drink a beer and enjoy it by itself. You don't have to be a beer nerd, but $8 and $10 is a lot to spend on one beer, and most Americans aren't really used to that. So what a lot of breweries are starting to think about is, there's more breweries popping up in my area. There's more competition. How can I have someone come in, sit down, and stay for a while? Well, if I paired it with food, not only make them stay longer and enjoy more beers and be able to drive after that, but I also make it so that they could bring a friend in, and maybe they've never had a porter before. Maybe that would be kind of foreign to them. But if you blend it with food, all of a sudden that beer takes on a different kind of flavor. It's like just eating pepperonis by themselves. Some people may like it, some people may not. But if you were to put it in a pizza and blend it with the sauce and the cheese and the crust, it's a whole different thing. And so a lot of the craft breweries are starting to take this on, and really I feel like a lot of what you said, as far as the direction that a lot of the restaurants are taking, it's kind of a subculture of that, and I feel like they're going to add to it and expand it as well.
Yeah. Ben, thanks so much for joining us, talking about craft beer. Definitely want to try some of these amazing brewers and beers that you just mentioned. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, man, it's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for joining us on Foodable Weekly as we cover topics across the industry. As you can see, Beverage Trends is really a hot one. We want to make sure that you guys check us out each week here on Foodable, and you can do so just by visiting us at foodabletv.com. Check out some of our other shows as well. Fast Casual Nation's doing some great stuff. My friends over at Rock My Restaurant, and of course our Geek Queens on Foodie Geek. We'll catch you next week right here on Foodable Weekly.